The Terrain version 2 Fractal is a really cool addition to Vue 10.5, and it's for creating more rocky type landscapes within procedural terrains. So we're going to go ahead and create terrain. I'm just adding in procedural terrain, and then we can go ahead and open up the editor. I'm going to turn off the zero edges tool for that. And then I'm going to set this to a world mapping mode, and then it's going to ask if I want to add any nodes to preserve the geometry. I'm going to select no, and I'm just going to reset the function. So right click and go to reset function. And then right click and we can edit the function in order to get into the function editor. So with the altitude output node selected, we can add in a fractal, and it'll automatically make our connections for us. And then from the pull-down menu or drop-down menu, we can select the Terrain Fractal version 2. I'm going to start by changing the wavelength on the XYZ to 4.5 all the way across. And we can see a really interesting rocky type landscape. There's quite a few controls to manipulate this. In the first group is just the standard, the base settings that are available in just about every single fractal node available in Vue. And then we have several new panels specific to this type of terrain. A lot of the controls are pretty straightforward, but there are a few different options that kind of work off of each other, and depending on the intensity of some of the other sliders, sometimes you won't really see the effect of a couple of these different options. And before we start making modifications, I'm just going to increase the scale of the output observer to about 2, and then we can also hold down the control key and right click with the mouse, click and drag to the right a little bit to zoom in, and that way we can see the geometry a little better. The first group after the base settings is the overall aspect, and this is for controlling the major shape of the rocky areas. And these are really the settings that are going to have the most dramatic effect. So the turbulence is basically a built-in turbulence. If you've ever worked with turbulence nodes, connecting them to origins, it'll allow you to distort the terrain. And then the turbulence damping is a way to basically kind of minimize some of the extreme turbulence and kind of balance it out. It sort of works like the stretch damping options in other fractals whenever you have wavelengths that differ along the X, Y, and Z. So it just allows you the ability to kind of balance things out so that the turbulence isn't overly strong. Now, a lot of these different inputs can also, you can enter in numeric value higher than the slider can go. Some of the options it's not available, and in some cases you really need to be careful if you're going to go over. But I think in this case with the turbulence, I'm going to set that to 0.7. It looks pretty interesting for now. The next option are the large scale smoothness and contrast, and these are independent values. So you don't need to have one on in order for the other to work. With the smoothness, we can start to balance out the areas from the higher peaks and the more jagged rocks, and kind of blend that in to what would be the buoyancy level. And basically the relative ground. So this is also one of those features that can you can set that up too. In this case, what it's going to do is really smooth everything out almost completely and remove a lot of the different rocks. So you can go pretty high with this value. It does reach a point where it's really not going to have much of an impact anymore. If we go ahead and turn that off, we're going to see that the edges for the rocky areas going into what's basically the ground is a lot sharper. And then we can fine-tune the rest of that area with the large-scale contrast. So they do work together, but you don't need to have one on in order to control the other. Large-scale contrast is another one where we can go over the maximum value and create a pretty interesting effect. I'm going to turn off the large-scale smoothness, and we can just bump that up. And that's another way to sharpen the edges and sort of create cliffs. So depending on how you want to blend that together. Buoyancy is probably going to have one of the largest impacts, at least depending on the way the bump surge is set up, rock abundance, and we'll take a look at the ground aspect next. But buoyancy, what we can do is basically take the peaks of the rocks and choose in which direction they go. So if you're used to the other terrain fractal, and the original terrain fractal, it's kind of like switching between billows and ridges, where at 1 it would be a ridge, and -1 it would be more of the billowy look, except it doesn't really work identically as the other options, because with the original terrain fractal it would really do more of an inversion to almost the entire terrain, with the exception to the smoothness value. Buoyancy, you can also go way beyond in negative or higher values in order to really pull out features if needed. So you can get some pretty interesting looking surfaces and terrains this way. In the next group, the ground aspect, the bump surge will allow you to adjust basically the height of the rock peaks. And you can kind of bump them up. It really depending on some of the other settings. Sometimes this is going to raise up areas a lot more. It is somewhat dependent on the other features and the other settings. So for now, we're just going to kind of leave that where it's at. We'll just jump down really quick to the strata processing, and we can turn that on. We can add a little layer spacing, turn that up a little higher, and that's going to affect just the rocky areas. And you can also increase that beyond the slider value, which is set to 0.15, but you can go a lot higher with it and get some interesting looking peaks. I'm going to go ahead and just bring it to 0.2, and we'll just stick with that for now. Okay, so going back to the ground aspect, the rock abundance is going to allow you to spread out the rocks throughout the entire terrain, and basically adjust the coverage level. So you can see now where those smoother areas from the contrast section, they're now, it's kind of creeping into more the ground level. So if we take that smoothness and just bring that back a little bit and kind of smooth that out. So we don't want to have it that high because we don't want it too rocky. I do want to have a little bit of variation. Also, the rock dispersion will allow you to basically adjust the roughness within that abundance level. So how far we spread out the rocks throughout the terrain is with the abundance, and then the dispersion will allow us to adjust the size of the rocks as it spreads out, and it's kind of a fall off where you'll get much smaller rocks towards the flatter surfaces. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of turn that down a little. And then we have a soil thickness level, and that's going to fill in the flatter ground areas. And if it's up really high, it'll basically create a very strong smoothing effect where you're not going to get a lot of detail. And you'll start to lose some of the higher detail rocks along that area if that's too high. I'm going to go ahead and take the buoyancy and just bring it down a little bit. And I think I might bring back the large scale smoothness a little bit more. So we've got some nice variations in there. Pull back the contrast. And then we can choose which way we want to have the buoyancy, whether or not we want the rocks more going inward, and then we can compensate if we need to with the bump surge to kind of pull back some more of the jagged rocks. So that way we could still have peaks almost going up by taking the buoyancy down and then sort of push it back up. It does give it a little more detail. And I'm going to go ahead and increase the dispersion level so that we get more of those sharp rocks and nice features down towards the bottom. And then you can also increase the overall roughness up at the top for everything, or you can reduce it as well. I'm just going to keep it at 0.5, which is the default, and that should work alright. So I think we'll just stick with this for now. We might need to increase the scale, but I think it should be okay. We can do that, any scale changes outside of the function editor. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And here we have the terrain. I'm going to go ahead and increase the scale to like 3.5 or so. That should be good. And then we can click OK again. Close that out. And now take a look at the terrain. And I'm going to decrease the height using the scale gizmo on the Z. Now this is a world terrain, so we can size it up and start to fill in the rest of the scene where we need it. So if you do want to load in the scene at this point, you can load in the Terrain Fractal version 2 scene file. It's included with the training. So next we're going to manipulate and add some materials for this. There are two secondary outputs for controlling the materials of this terrain within the fractal. So we have to go into the function editor and add a couple of custom outputs. And I might even go back in actually to this scale and just raise it up on the Z a little bit, bringing it back. And I'm going to adjust the sun. So F4 on the keyboard to open the atmosphere editor. You can go to the top, atmosphere, atmosphere editor. And I'm just going to bring the sun around a little, adjust the heading, and maybe pick up, just change the pitch a little bit. What I can also do is grab the sunlight and go into the numerics tab, and for orientation, select roll to adjust the angle of it a little more. Okay, so now we can open up the terrain editor. Also, because it is a world terrain, the size we're seeing right now in the scale is going to be relative to the original size that we created it in before we sized it. And that's in order to maintain anything we paint. If we wanted to paint materials on or make any changes that way, it's going to lock to that zone. So in order to be able to see the entire terrain, and since we don't have anything painted right now, I'm just going to go ahead and delete the zone, click OK, and it'll automatically create a new zone. I'm going to go ahead and edit the function, and I may just decrease that smoothness level a little because we did lose some of the definition, and I'm going to bring the buoyancy back a little bit more to negative 0.22 for the buoyancy, and just make a couple of additional changes. Okay, so now what we're going to do is just click to get the red selection box. We're right click, go to Add Output Custom Dependency. And what we want to do is connect this to the output of the terrain fractal, and we're going to select the rough areas. Now this one has a control. It is the reference feature size. And to give you an idea what that looks like, what we can do is disconnect the altitude from the altitude output, connect it to the rough areas, and then take a look at the output for this. So the reference feature size we can define up to the largest feature. If it goes beyond the largest feature, it won't really work anymore. And it looks like it's not really giving us much of an idea. I'll go ahead and zoom in. We can see that more. So anytime we go above that largest feature size, it will kind of revert back to the really dense area. And it looks like it might be going a little bit beyond that. At the moment, it actually looks like anything above 2.5 or so is reverting back. That might actually be caused by the scale that I have set within the function editor. If it's set to 1, typically this would be a range from 0 up until 10, because 10 is the largest feature. But you can see how you can adjust the different feature sizes and what you want to control. I'm going to go ahead and leave it basically at 0 for the output, and then disconnect the altitude and reconnect it to the altitude of the terrain fractal. Could be pretty rough too, because I've got the bump surge a little higher, and the rock dispersion might need to just bring it back a little. So there's also another output, and I'm going to add output custom dependency and connect this to the very rough areas, the more concentrated. This is great for filling in the smoother surfaces between all the rocks. So I'm just going to call this one contrast, and this other one I'm going to call rough. I do want to note that if you're making changes and you have these connected to control your material, try not to click in the main camera while the terrain editor is open to refresh it, because it will remove the connection to that external dependency once it's connected. Okay, so what we're going to start with is a base layer, basically a rock layer. So we're going to load in a material, and I'm going to go to the rocks and select the gray-brown rock. And then I'm going to edit the material, and I'm going to add an additional layer. I'm going to go ahead and add grass. Set the alpha boost to 0. Now before we connect the alpha production to the custom dependency, we need to open the terrain editor, click OK and close it, because then it'll add the layer painting node, which isn't there unless you open the terrain editor. It won't be there. And then if you make any connection to the alpha, say the external dependency, and then open the terrain editor, it will delete the connection. So you want to make sure that you add your materials and then open the terrain editor. I'm also going to go ahead and add the grass variations material. And we'll just set the alpha boost to -100 for now. We'll focus on the grass. Open the terrain editor, close it, and that way we can get our layer painting node. We're going to go back to the grass, edit the function. We can right click in here, add input external dependency, and we're going to choose the contrast area for the grass. Now with alphas in Vue and the material editor, black is what shows through. So it is kind of reverse of typical alphas. And I'm going to go ahead back into that material and just modify that grass and darken it up a little. Maybe not quite so much. And I think I'll desaturate it just a little bit. So I'm just going to go ahead and render this out so we can take a look at how it currently looks with just these two materials. So here we can see the grass material filling in between all of the really fine rocks throughout the entire terrain. And then the larger peaks hardly have the material on it at all. You can see the much larger sections kind of sticking out there. So now we're going to take a look at the second material, control. We're going to go to the grass variation. I'm going to change the alpha boost to 0, and that way we're fully covering it for the moment until we change the alpha production. And I'm going to change the overall color for this to more of a redder type of surface, something a little darker. Then we can edit the alpha production. So right click, edit function, and then add input node external dependency, and choose the rough output. Now I may end up modifying or reversing it, but first let's just take a look how it's currently set up. And I'm going to just move the camera so that we can get a little closer to the surface. And that way we can see these details better. So here we can see that new brown material being applied basically to where the grass areas are, but also fading into the rocks. It's more of a fall off, a gradient type transition. It's not so sharp like the higher contrast area. Now, if we want to reverse this and say affect the rocks with it, we can go back into the alpha production, and immediately after the external dependency, we can add a filter node. Now, you don't want to add anything in between the layer painting and the alpha output, because it'll just get removed and deleted. So we want to keep everything above the layer painting. I'm going to add a map filter, so just click in the link, add a filter, and select the map. So we're going to take a look at the output. And it looks like it's more between 0 and 1. So we'll take our lower range for the input range and set it to 0 to 1. And then we can change our output to -1 to 1 in order to get more of a full coverage that way. But if we want to reverse it, we can just make the lower value 1 and the upper value -1. And it looks like that's not showing too much right now. So what we can do is bring in the upper value, say 0.6, or just start stepping it in that way. And then this is going to cover just the rock. So now we can blend on just the rock layer if you want to use this for that. I did like the way that looked before, with kind of a full coverage. It's kind of neat looking. So I think what I'm going to do is actually take the upper value, increase it a little bit more in order to kind of blend it in. And I will take the lower value, -0.2, to kind of fade it out even more, maybe -0.3. And of course you can use any filter in here. We could use a parabolic filter, make additional modifications that way. I'll go ahead and click OK, and we can also use the environment controls in order to add even more variation to this. So let's say we just want to have this more reddish material just show up on the steeper surfaces. We can maybe bring that down. We'll start at 35 for the slope range to 180, and then we're going to adjust and pull out the steep and the flat areas. We'll do about 6% for each. Now, because of the clipping that I applied to the external dependency, we've got a lot more coverage, and it's almost completely covering the grass. We really can't see much of it. So if we want to bring that back, the easiest thing to do is just move the grass above that layer we just added. Now it's a really high contrast for the grass, and the grass is now covering everything. So we could go into the slope range, and if we want to limit it, say just to sort of the flatter areas, what I'm going to do is bring that to about, we'll do 55, and then we're going to adjust the steep and the flat fuzziness areas. And we'll go ahead and we'll just type 8 for both. And that should cover it in a bit more. So that definitely looks a lot better now. Start to bring the grass back in. And another thing I want to do is reduce a bit of that red material, which we can do with really easily with one of the new color nodes that's been added. So we're going to go with that grass variation, which is the red surface, edit the function, and we've got that map set up on it. And what I want to control, it looks like the lower value is going to give us the best, and maybe the upper. We'll just have to connect one, and if it doesn't work, we'll just reconnect it. So I'm going to extract from the map. We'll start with the lower value, see how that works out. And I'm going to just have the constant node selected and replace it with a color map, and then we can change it to the terrain color patterns. This doesn't actually produce any color, it's just a grayscale output. But it's a great way to kind of blend things together. I'm going to increase the scale, and then what we can do is pull down the buoyancy a little. It has some of the same controls as the Terrain Fractal, the version 2. So just bringing the buoyancy down to darken it and control that map output a little better. We can roughen it up a little. Increase our roughness trend at higher frequency. We can also add bump surge. And increase the rock abundance. And that should be good. And we'll see how that looks. Okay, so this is how it looked before, and I've just got the compare tool turned on. And then we can take a look at the new variation. So it just adds a little more detail, makes it a little more interesting, subtracting some of those areas. And then we can just modify and edit that terrain color pattern in order to customize it a little more. We could also set something up with the grass using it, but I think for now I'm just going to go ahead and save out this scene at the current state so you can load it in. And take a look at it if you want to play around with it. Make modifications to the terrain, and because we have the custom outputs connected, the materials should adjust accordingly and fill in the correct areas. So this one I've been saving in a couple of different steps, and I'm going to save this one now as Terrain Fractal version 2, and then materials number 3 is what this one will be saved as. And if you want to learn more about the terrain color patterns color node, you can check out the lesson for that within the training for different techniques and usage of that node, because it's a really cool new addition. Since it doesn't actually produce any sort of color output, which is a little misleading. The lesson will show you different ways you can use it to distribute color in different materials.